Welcome to the Edgeworth Echoes podcast, discovering Edgeworth's town, a hidden gem of Irish history.
Hello and welcome to this edition of the Edgeworth Echoes podcast. This is your host, John. In this episode, we are taking a look at Mariah Edgeworth's great passion, children's education, a passion she shared with her father and stepmother. Mariah's work in this field began almost by accident. In the bustling Edgeworth household, Mariah often entertained her numerous younger siblings with stories. These tales eventually formed the basis of her first published work for children, The Parent's Assistant, released in 1796. Edgeworth's stories featured real children with authentic personalities and flaws. Her tales often included subtle moral lessons, and despite the educational elements, Edgeworth's stories remained entertaining and lively. One of the collection's most famous stories, The Purple Jar, featured a young girl named Rosamond, who must decide between buying a beautiful but impractical jar or a necessary pair of shoes, teaching her a lesson about impulsive choices and prioritising needs over wants. Lazy Lawrence promoted the virtues of hard work, and Simple Susan, which underscores kindness and family loyalty. For later editions of the book, illustrations were provided by Frances Beaufort, later to become the fourth wife of Richard Lovell. With a growing number of children in the house, Mariah had a ready-made audience to test her stories upon. She wrote the stories on a slate, read them out to her sisters and brothers, and if they approved, copied them. This growing band of children and their educational needs let Mariah, her father, and Mariah's stepmother, Honora, explore early education theories to experiment with the family. In her biography of Mariah, the writer Helen Zimmerman recounts the way the family approached this.
Practical education was the outcome of a series of observations and facts relative to children, not originally intended for publication, registered first by Mr. Edgeworth and his wife Honora. Maria began in 1791 to note down anecdotes of the children around her and to write out some of her father's conversation lessons. The authors of Practical Education did not seek to appeal to grave and learned persons like the former writers on these themes, but to the bulk of mankind, in whose hands, after all, lies their application.
Practical Education, first published in 1798, was the result of these years of observation and experimentation. The children in the stories were realistic and had their flaws. Mariah sought to instill values and lessons that would help shape young readers' character and behaviour. Rather than fantasy or fairy tales, her narratives featured relatable characters facing common challenges and dilemmas that the young readers could connect with. The Edgeworths proposed that education should be tailored to a child's natural interests and development stage, a concept that influenced later educational theorists like Maria Montessori. They advocated for learning through real-world experiences, arguing that children gain knowledge best by actively engaging in activities rather than passive study. Mariah described their thinking in a letter to her aunt many years after the book was published.
We took Miss Lawrence to one of the great schools established here on the Lancasterian principles, and we also took her to hear a man lecture upon the mode of teaching arithmetic and geometry which my father has recommended in Practical Education. Surely it would be doing good service to bring into popular form all that metaphysicians have discovered which can be applied to practice in education. This was early and long my father's object. The art of teaching to invent, I dare not say, but of awakening and assisting the inventive power by daily exercise and excitement, and by the application of philosophic principles to trivial occurrences, he believed might be pursued with infinite advantage to the rising generation.
The book had its critics. It was considered too sectarian since there was no religious references or instructions. This was something both Richard and Mariah felt strongly about, and it was reflected in their schools. that religion should be separate from the school and religious instruction should be carried out by priests or vicars and not by the teacher. Despite this, the book was well received, with translations appearing all over the continent. One of the earliest translators was Marc Auguste Pictet. Maria and Marc Auguste had an historical connection through their collaboration on the translation and publication of Education Pratique in 1801. This work was undertaken by Pictet, who was involved in literary and scientific pursuits in Geneva. In 1802, in a letter to Sophie Ruxton, Maria spoke of an encounter she had in Paris regarding a translation of the book.
While I was looking out of the window, a gentleman came in who had passed many years in Spain. He began to talk to me about Madrid, and when he heard my name, he said, "A Spanish lady is translating Practical Education from the French. She understands English, and he gave us her address that we may send a copy of the book to her."
In 1802, Richard Lovell Edgeworth wrote to Charlotte Sneyd, also from Paris, about a visit to a school there.
"We went by appointment to Madame Campan's, she keeps the greatest boarding school in France, to meet Madame Recamier, the beautiful lady who had been nearly squeezed to death in London. How we liked the school and its conductress, who professes to follow practical education."
As the years went on, the book became an influence for other pioneers in the field of education. There was Friedrich Froebel, who developed the concept of kindergarten and emphasised play-based learning. There was John Dewey, who pioneered progressive education, emphasising learning through experience and problem solving rather than more rote memorisation. And there was Maria Montessori, who pioneered the Montessori method, focusing on child-led learning and hands-on activities. A conference held in Edgeworth to mark the 225th anniversary of the publication of the book attracted speakers from Britain, Ireland, Italy and the USA. So one final word from Maria on the committee who helped the writing of the book, the children in the family.
I am very much obliged to Bessie and Charlotte for copying the errata of Practical Education for me, and should be extremely obliged to the whole Committee of Education and Criticism at Edgeworthstown, if they would send corrections to me from their own brains. An octavo edition of Practical Education is to come out at Christmas. We have seen a volume, which looks as well as can be expected.
So there we wind up this episode of the podcast. We hope you continue to like and share the podcast and look forward to the next episode. If you're interested in learning more about the Society and the history they preserve, please visit www.mariaedgeworthcentre.com. You can sign up to our newsletter, book tours, learn about our annual literary festival and read up on some of the remarkable people who have links to our town.
This has been the Edgeworth Echoes podcast, rediscovering history.